Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in my series reading The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Without further ado, returning to The Call of the Wild as read by Lord Naren White. 3 men from a neighboring tent came out and looked on, grinning and winking at one another. You got a right smart load as it is, said one of them. And it's not me you should tell your business, but I wouldn't tote that tent along if I was you. Undreamed of, cried Mercedes, throwing up her hands in a dainty dismay. However in the world could I manage without a tent? It's springtime, and you won't get any more cold weather, the man replied. She shook her head decidedly, and Charles and Hal put the last odds and ends on top of the mountainous load. Think it'll ride? One of the men asked. Why shouldn't it? Charles demanded rather shortly. Oh, that's all right, the man hastened meekly to say. I was just a-wondering, that is all. It seemed a mite top-heavy. Charles turned his back and drew the lashings down as well as he could, which was not in the least well. And of course the dogs can hike along all day with that contraption behind them, affirmed a second of the men. Certainly, said Hal, with a freezing politeness, taking hold of the gee-pole with one hand and swinging his whip from the other. Mush! He shouted. Mush on there! The dogs sprang against the breast bands, strained hard for a few moments, then relaxed. They were unable to move the sled. The lazy brutes! I'll show them, he cried, preparing to lash out at them with the whip. But Mercedes interfered, crying, Oh, Hal, you mustn't, as she caught hold of the whip and wrenched it from him. The poor dears! Now you must promise you won't be harsh with them for the rest of the trip, or I won't go a step. Precious lot you know about the dogs, her brother sneered, and I wish you'd leave me alone. They're lazy, I tell you, and you've got to whip them to get anything out of them. That's their way. You ask anyone, ask one of those men. Mercedes looked at them imploringly, untold repugnance at the sight of pain written in her pretty face. They're weak as water, if you want to know, came the reply from one of the men. Plumb tuckered out, that's what's the matter. They need a rest. Rest be blanked, said Hal, with his beardless lips, and Mercedes said, Oh, in pain and sorrow at the oath. But she was a clannish creature and rushed at once to the defense of her brother. Never mind that man, she said pointedly. You're driving our dogs, and you do what you think best with them. Against Hal's whip fell upon the dogs. They threw themselves against the breast bands, dug their feet into the packed snow, and got down low to it, and put forth all their strength. The sled held as though it were an anchor. After 2 efforts they stood still, panting. The whip was whistling savagely when once more Mercedes interfered. She dropped on her knees before Buck with tears in her eyes and put her arms around his neck. You poor dears, she cried sympathetically. Why don't you pull hard? Then you wouldn't be whipped. Buck did not like her, but he was feeling too miserable to resist her, taking it as part of the day's miserable work. One of the onlookers, who had been clenching his teeth to suppress hot speech, now spoke up. It's not that I care a whoop what becomes of you, but for the dogs' sakes I just want to tell you, you can help them a mighty lot by breaking out that sled. The runners are froze fast. Throw your weight against the gee-pole, right and left, and break it out. A 3rd time the attempt was made, but this time, following the advice, Hal broke out the runners which had been frozen to the snow. The overlooked and unwieldy sled forged ahead, Buck and his mates struggling frantically under the rain of blows. 100 yards ahead, the path turned and sloped steeply into the main street. It would have required an experienced man to keep the top-heavy sled upright, and Hal was not such a man. As they swung on the turn, the sled went over, spilling half its load through the loose lashings. The dogs never stopped. The lightning sled bounded on its side behind them. They were angry because of the ill treatment they had received and the unjust load. Buck was raging. He broke into a run, the team following his lead. Hal cried, Whoa! Whoa! But they gave no heed. He tripped and was pulled off his feet. The capsized sled ground over him, and the dogs dashed on up the street, adding to the gaiety of Skagway, as they scattered the remainder of the outfit along its chief thoroughfare. Kind-hearted citizens caught the dogs and gathered up the scattered belongings. Also, they gave advice. Half the load and twice the dogs, if they ever expected to reach Dawson, was what they said. Hal and his sister and brother-in-law listened unwillingly, pitched tent, and overhauled the outfit. Canned goods were turned out that made men laugh, for canned goods on the long trail is a thing to dream about. Blankets for a hotel, quoth one of the men who laughed and helped. Half as many is too much. Get rid of them. Throw away that tent and all those dishes. Who's going to wash them anyway? Good Lord, do you think you're traveling on a Pullman? And so it went. The inexorable elimination of the superfluous, Mercedes cried when her clothes bags were dumped on the ground and article after article was thrown out. She cried in general, and she cried in particular over each discarded thing. She clasped hands at about knees, rocking back and forth broken-heartedly. She averred she would not go an inch, not for a dozen Charleses. She appealed to everybody and to everything, finally wiping her eyes and proceeding to cast out even articles of apparel that were imperative necessaries. And in her zeal, when she had finished with her own, she attacked the belongings of her men and went through them like a tornado. This accomplished the outfit, though cut in half, was still a formidable bulk. Charles and Hal went out in the evening and brought 6 outside dogs. These, added to the 6 of the original team, and Teek and Kuna, the Huskies obtained the Pink Rapid on the record trip, brought the team up to 14. But the outside dogs, though practically broken in since their landing, did not amount to much. 3 were short-haired pointers, 1 was a Newfoundland, and the other 2 were mongrels of indeterminate breed. They did not seem to know anything, these newcomers. Buck and his comrades looked upon them with disgust, though he speedily taught them their places and what not to do. He could not teach them what to do. They did not take kindly to trace and trail. With the exception of the 2 mongrels, they were bewildered and spirit broken by the strange savage environment in which they found themselves, and by the ill treatment they had received. The 2 mongrels were without spirit at all. Bones were the only things breakable about them. With the newcomers hopeless and forlorn, and the old team worn out by 2,500 miles of continuous trail, the outlook was anything but bright. The 2 men, however, were quite cheerful, and they were proud too. They were doing the thing in style with 14 dogs. They had seen other sleds depart over the pass for Dawson, or come in from Dawson, but never had they seen a sled with so many as 14 dogs. In the nature of Arctic travel, there was a reason why 14 dogs should not drag one sled, and that was that one sled could not carry the food for 14 dogs. But Charles and Hal did not know this. They had worked the trip out with a pencil, so much to a dog, so many dogs, so many days. QED Mercedes looked over their shoulders and nodded comprehensively. It was all so simple. Late next morning, Buck led the long team up the street. There was nothing lively about it, no snap or go in him and his fellows. They were starting dead weary. 4 times he had covered the distance between Saltwater and Dawson, and the knowledge that, jaded and tired, he was facing the same trail once more made him bitter. His heart was not in the work, nor was the heart of any dog. The outsiders were timid and frightened, the insides without confidence in their masters. Buck felt vaguely that there was no depending upon these 2 men and the women. They did not know how to do anything, and as the days went by it became apparent that they could not learn. They were slack in all things, without order or discipline. It took them half the night to pitch a slovenly camp, and half the morning to break that camp and get the sled loaded in fashion, so slovenly that for the rest of the day they were occupied in stopping and rearranging the load. Some days they did not make 10 miles. On other days they were unable to get started at all, and on no day did they succeed in making more than half the distance used by the men as a basis in their dog food computation. It was inevitable that they should go short on dog food, but they hastened it by overfeeding, bringing the day nearer when underfeeding would commence. The outside dogs whose digestions had not been trained by chronic famine to make the most of little, had voracious appetites. And when, in addition to this, the worn-out huskies pulled weakly, Hal decided that the orthodox ration was too small. We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.